Printed reproduction of the classic work by Raphael, where you have, sorry, it might be hard to see in the back, but you can see, by the way, the real thing in the Vatican if you ever want to see the real painting. So we have a grouping of philosophers studying and learning together, and in their center we have two prominent figures. Now I will now zoom in on this so we can better see this area. So here we have the two guys walking side by side, and on this side we have Plato pointing up like toward an ideal, suggesting that he's an idealist, while on this side we have Aristotle kind of holding his hand onto the ground, trying to remind us to come back down to the real world from time to time, because he's a realist. So for Plato, the only thing that's real is an idea. So in order to understand truth, one must understand ideas. But then Aristotle comes and says, that's nonsense. What's actually real is what's actually real in the real world, in the real place. In other words, that which is, is. So of course, this may not sound like a very deep thing at first, but if you think a bit about it, it can really affect the choices you may make in your life, depending on how far you take this statement. So Aristotelianism was basically a rejection of Platonic idealism. So for Plato, concepts had a universal or ideal form. So this led to his idealistic philosophy, while Aristotle said that in order to understand the true nature of something, you must actually analyze the individual instance of a concept or object. And this, of course, evolved into Aristotelian empiricism and was the foundation of what we now know as the scientific method, which was developed over time. So Aristotle really thought that in order to understand something, you need to observe and experience that thing, while Plato thought that it's enough to reason about things in order to prove a concept without necessarily experimenting. So in the topic of logic, Plato preferred what's known as inductive reasoning, so where you start with some observations and you reach a conclusion, but the thing is that even if the premises are correct in inductive reasoning, the conclusion may not be correct. For example, it can go like this. Let's say I've seen a cat, it's black. I've seen a second cat, it's black. I've seen a third cat, it's black. Therefore, all cats must be black. This is, of course, a wrong conclusion. A worse one could be, I expect cats to be black. By contrast, Aristotle prefers deductive reasoning. So he was basically he created the basic unit of logic, the syllogism. So if you consider the premise that A equals B and B equals C, the two premises, then A must equal C. So the conclusion is guaranteed provided that the premises are correct. Further on the topic of politics, we have a huge divide here as well, with Plato, who sought to imagine an ideal state, and Aristotle, who sought to design a workable government. So Plato imagines a society where there is no concept of family, there are no property rights, and he tries to transcend human selfishness. And of course his goal is to social unity, and he sees this as a main cause of social disunity and disagreement, so it must be removed in order to reach his ideal society. Now, of course, the question is, who would really want to live in such a society? And one of the main detractors is Aristotle himself, who gives this example that he'd rather want to be somebody's cousin in the real world rather than somebody's son in Plato's world, because in Plato's world everybody is the child of everybody else, so the word kind of loses meaning, right? So in contrast, Aristotle says that selfishness is part of our nature and we cannot really transcend it, and we must acknowledge it and perhaps mitigate more negative aspects of it. So he tries to envision a working society that maintains property rights, that tries to create a balance between rich and poor, and that also tries to bring people together to work under a set of common law or rules. And finally, even though for both philosophers, both philosophers thought thinking is superior to the senses, Plato saw the senses as something that primarily misleads somebody, while Aristotle said that the senses are paramount to understanding the true nature of reality around us. So, in conclusion, I've briefly presented some of the contrasts between idealism and realism in ancient Greece, embodied by the two famous philosophers, Plato pointing upward at the ideal, and Aristotle holding his hand over the ground, perhaps trying to remind his teacher from time to time that we live in the real world after all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. That was really inspiring.